The speaker, of course, is Liza Mundy. She is a former New York Times reporter. She is the best-selling author of The Richer Sex, How the New Majority of Female Breadwinners is Transforming Sex, Love, and Family, and Michelle, a Biography. She was a longtime reporter at the Washington Post, not New York Times, and has contributed to numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Time, The New Republic, Slate, Mother Jones, and Politico. She's a frequent commentator on prominent national television shows, radio, and also online news outlets. A senior fellow at New America, Mundy is one of the nation's foremost experts on women and work issues. Liza.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah, it's great to be here. This is a very important piece of property, actually, that played a big role in the code-breaking story. And since my book was published, I've given book talks in a lot of different venues. I've given several book talks in secure facilities around this area, but this is the first time I've ever given a book talk in a brewery. But at least you've had a chance to get your drink, so I'm not competing with the cocktail hour, although I know some of you are probably waiting until afterwards. So it's great to be here at Bent Hill. As I said, this is a very meaningful place, and I know that there's nothing more exciting than a good PowerPoint presentation, but I promise you that I don't have any charts or graphs or graphics. I have historical photos that I came upon when I was doing my research. Some of them are in the book, but there are a number that I just didn't have the room for in the book, and so I really love the opportunity to show them at talks and talk about the content. So I'd like to start with this photo because I think it illustrates very well the plight of the educated woman in 1942. The women who you see on this platform were seniors at Goucher College in the spring of 1942. Goucher, as you may know, was a women's college back then. It was located in the heart of urban Baltimore. Today, it's a coeducational university. It's located in suburban Towson, but it was very much a women's school back in 1942. The young women who attended Goucher were much more unusual even than they would have realized. Only 4% of American women in 1942 got a four-year college degree. And the reason that percentage was so small was because so many campuses were still closed to women. All the Ivy League pretty much were closed to women. Many private colleges were closed to women. In our state of Virginia, UVA did not grant full degrees to women back then. So there were a lot of places where women weren't welcome. And even at coeducational universities, there was often a cap on the number of women who could attend, and so women's colleges were really one of the only truly welcoming places for women who wanted to get a four-year education, and they were actually founded, most of them, in the late 19th century, at a time when people actually believed that higher education wasn't particularly good for women, that it could be harmful for women, that it made them sort of uppity and unpleasant. And that too much learning was a bad thing. There was a Harvard physician in the late 19th century who argued that higher education made women infertile because it swelled their brains at the expense of their wombs. And of course, because he was from Harvard, people believed that. And so these schools were founded at a time when the presidents and the deans and the funders really needed to prove that it was worthwhile to educate women. And so they had an uphill battle. And also the young women who were attending schools like Goucher, often families were less willing to pay the tuition for a daughter than for a son, for the economic reason that the job opportunities for a college-educated woman to make her tuition worthwhile were really very minimal. If you were a college-educated woman, really your only field that you could reliably expect a job in was school teaching. And that's great if you want to be a school teacher, but if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a businesswoman or an architect or an engineer, then your pickings are going to be a lot slimmer. And so often families made the economic calculation that it just wasn't worthwhile coming out of the Depression to send your daughter to college. And a lot of these women would have been on scholarship, actually. I've interviewed them, and a number of them were either working their way through school or on scholarship. But one of the reasons that you might send your daughter to college, that you make a different economic calculation, was that she could get the proverbial MRS degree. That in addition to getting a fine education at a great school like Goucher, she could date men from the Naval Academy, which was 20 miles away, or Johns Hopkins or other men's schools, and thereby make a marriage and assure her own prospects that way. And that was a very, that was such an accepted reason for a young woman to go to college that schools like Wellesley College in their yearbook in 1942 actually had a list of all the women who were engaged and who they were engaged to, and it also had a list of marriages. So it had a list of all the women who had left before graduating in order to get married, and then who they married. So again, I've interviewed a number of the women on this platform, and they all described great academic pressure because these were great schools. The dean of Goucher, Dorothy Stimson, was an expert on Copernicus. The English professor, Ola Winslow, was the first American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in biography. So they had top-notch faculty, but they described really intense marital pressure, a lot of competition. And so what I love about this photo is that so they had these rituals. All these schools had these rituals at the end of the year. So as far as I can tell, a May court was sort of a vestige of a pagan fertility ritual. And the women would be dressed in their virginal white and symbolically ushered into the marriage market. Similarly, Wellesley had something called the senior class hoop roll. And the lore around the hoop roll was that whoever won the hoop roll would be the class's first bride. So again, emphasis on the next stage of the life course after graduation being marriage. But what I love about this photo is that two of the women, this is Jacqueline Jenkins, and later after the war when she gets married, her name will be Jacqueline Jenkins Nye, mother of Bill Nye, the science guy, so you can get a sense of her intellectual chops. And this was her friend Gwyneth Gaminder. So these two women, unbeknownst to anybody on that platform, had already been secretly tapped by the US Navy, and they had spent their senior years training to become cryptanalysts, training to become code breakers. This was top secret training they were getting. They were taught by Ola Winslow in a locked classroom at the top of Goucher Hall. Nobody on that platform would have known that they were training to become naval code breakers. They couldn't tell their family, they couldn't tell their friends, they couldn't tell their roommates, they couldn't tell anybody that they were preparing for a completely different field of endeavor and ultimately a completely different life course than anybody looking at them on that platform would have expected. And of course, the reason that they had been tapped to learn how to do this work that they never would have heard of before their senior year is because on December 7th, 1941, we were bombed at Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise attack. It was a great shock to the American public. The Japanese thought it would bring us to our knees and that we would allow them to keep the territory that they captured in the Pacific. But of course, it had the opposite effect on the American public. The American public rose up in outrage. All of the young men signed up to fight. Of course, we declare war on Japan the next day. Germany declares war on us 3 days later. And all of a sudden, we are at war, in both of our major oceans, what was called total war. And all the young men are shipping out at exactly the time that we've suddenly identified this crying intelligence need. Because of course, as you know, the other thing about Pearl Harbor, in addition to being the event that propels us into war, is that it was a massive intelligence failure, particularly on the part of the US Navy. That our entire Pacific Fleet just about was headquartered, anchored in Pearl Harbor. We knew that something was going to happen in the Pacific. We didn't know where, and somehow we hadn't anticipated that it would happen at the very place where we had our fleet moored up. So there was, as you know, I'm sure, there was a lot of recrimination in the Navy. Careers were ended. There was enormous guilt. There was a lot of recrimination. And also there was a realization that even as we are entering this massive global war, sending all of our young men on destroyers and aircraft carriers and convoys across the Atlantic, that our intelligence capability is minimal, that we don't have at this point any of our modern intelligence agencies. I mean, as you all know as well or better than I, we have 17 intelligence agencies now. We have intelligence agencies that exist to oversee other intelligence agencies. But in World War II, we didn't have a CIA, we didn't have an NSA, we didn't have a director of national intelligence. We have to build all this stuff from scratch. So of course, the OSS will be founded. We will start, building spy networks overseas, working with the British, working with people in occupied countries. But that's going to take a while. And so what we can start doing right away is significantly improve our ability to intercept signals. And of course, all of these signals that are being sent by Admiral Donitz or being sent by the Japanese Navy or the Japanese Army, they're all being enciphered and encrypted and encoded in different ways. So we have to intercept them. We have to build a lot more intercept stations, and then we have to learn how to decrypt these messages in time that somebody can do something about whatever is in their content. So at exactly the time then that the U.S. military would normally have turned to educated young men to learn how to do this code-breaking intelligence work, those men have become unavailable. So when I was doing my research at the National Archives, is there a reason why this isn't advancing, do you know? Oh, that's it. Yeah. So at the very moment when the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army would have turned to men, the men were suddenly unavailable. And so when I was doing my research at the National Archives in College Park, I literally found this memo where the light bulb moment has gone on above somebody's head, and I don't know how visible that is, but this is a monthly memo that the Navy was producing, even before the war, in which every month they would type up where they were finding their code breakers. So before World War II, the Navy had a very small code breaking bureau, and they would periodically turn to like MIT or Yale or various sources to find sort of the peculiar kinds of minds that were good at code breaking. You can see the kind of, they would offer a correspondence course to those people. So you can see some of the assignments, but you can see on your right-hand side that somebody has literally typed new source women's colleges. So the decision is made in the U.S. Navy, if the educated men we would normally turn to do this work are unavailable to us, then let's see what the educated women can do. So as a result of this light bulb moment, women at Goucher, as well as all the Seven Sisters colleges, women at Mount Holyoke, Radcliffe, Smith, Bryn Mawr, all those women's colleges, women in their senior year who are secretly tapped or identified by their math professor or their astronomy professor or other faculty members receive a secret summons to a meeting individually, one by one. They're brought in and asked 2 questions. Do you like crossword puzzles, and are you engaged to be married? And if they answered yes to the first and no to the second, then like those women at Goucher, they would be invited to take this correspondence course that the Navy had developed to train code breakers. And so what's interesting is that a lot of the women actually were engaged because there was so much pressure to get married when World War II started. Men wanted somebody at home waiting for them, a sweetheart. They wanted somebody to write to. So often the women were engaged, but they lied because whatever they were being invited to do sounded much more interesting than sitting around and waiting to see if their brothers or their boyfriends or their fiancés or their husbands were going to be okay. So that was the U.S. Navy's recruiting strategy right after Pearl Harbor, is to target these really elite, prestigious women's schools who they see as the female equivalent of the Ivy League. So those women, for the most part, are going to start out working the Japanese Naval Fleet Code. Upon our entry into World War II, the British have primary code-breaking responsibility for the European theater and the Atlantic Ocean. So the British are primarily responsible for the Enigma cipher. And if you've seen The Imitation Game, I'm sure you all know about the Enigma cipher. It's the machine that has rotors that encrypt German messages. It's in every U-boat. Admiral Donitz is communicating with every U-boat using the Enigma machine. And so the British have been working that system for several years. They've broken it thanks to Alan Turing and others. So we're very vested in that effort because we're sending our boys on convoys across the ocean. Our supply ships are sunk immediately after the war. The coast of North Carolina becomes called Torpedo Junction because we're losing so many supply ships. So we care about the Enigma cipher system, but the British are going to have primary responsibility for that at first. But we have sole code-breaking responsibility or lead responsibility for the Pacific Ocean, for the enormous Pacific Ocean, where we want to make sure another Pearl Harbor doesn't happen again. So the women who are recruited by the U.S. Navy will, for the most part, when they come to Washington in the summer of '42, be working the Japanese Naval Fleet Code, the JN-25, the major fleet code that the Japanese Navy uses. But our U.S. Army also needs code breakers because our Army is responsible for the Japanese Army's code and cipher systems. The Japanese Army is now spread out around the Pacific. It's on islands, it's on land masses. They're all communicating back with headquarters. They're communicating with each other. They're communicating with supply ships. It's all being done by radio, Morse code. It's all enciphered, and that's what our Army has to break. And so, again, like the Navy, the Army is looking for smart, resourceful people who can learn how to do this work. And because the Navy has sewn up the women's colleges of the Northeastern Seaboard, the Army decides to go after school women and teachers' colleges, because these are the other institutions that exist to educate women. So Dorothy Romali, who is still alive, I interviewed her for the book. She grew up in rural Pennsylvania. Her aspiration was to become a math teacher. That was an ambitious goal for a woman back then, because women weren't encouraged to go into math. They often weren't hired as math teachers, but that was her passion. But when she was called in by the Dean of Women at Indiana State Teachers College and offered the Army's cryptanalytic training course, she immediately said yes and began training in code breaking. But it turned out that even women at teachers' colleges weren't going to be enough for the numbers of women that the Army was going to need. So they decided to go after school teachers. They decided to go after young, underpaid, overworked, young women, primarily at the beginning of this recruiting effort, the Army is confined to recruiting from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and West Virginia, the 4th Civil Service District, because they're recruiting the women as civilians. And so women in these southern states were recruited. This is my central character, Dot Braden, who is also still alive. She'll be 98 next month. She was teaching school. She grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, but she was teaching school in Chatham, Virginia, at Chatham High School, when war broke out. So the Army strategy was a little bit different. They decided to send their handsomest young Army officers out. And I literally found references to this strategy in oral histories that I read by the commanding officers, who were very proud of this strategy. They talked about getting barefoot girls from West Virginia. And they sent their handsomest young Army officers out to station themselves in post offices and hotels all around these states with the hope that they could lure the young women to Washington, because they would think that they could make a marriage in Washington to a man who looked like that. And their thinking was that Southern women are particularly susceptible to the charms of a handsome man, so this was how they were going to get all of these code breakers. But what I love about that strategy is that Dot shows how wrong-headed it really was, and all of the reasons why the women took the job, that in fact sort of did have something to do with marriage, but not in the way you'd think. So Dot grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia. She was the oldest daughter in a family of 4 kids. Both of her brothers were in the Army by now. They were younger than she was. Daughter of a single mother. Her mother worked in a uniform factory in Lynchburg called Duty Duds. Her mother wanted Dot to have better opportunities in life. So she really wanted Dot to go to Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, another very fine school. And Dot went on scholarship, and she worked her way through school, also working at a florist's, because they didn't have a lot of money. And so the only job she could get out of Randolph-Macon was teaching school in Chatham. She was making $900 a year teaching school. And her college boyfriend, who was now in training camp in California, had sent her a ring because he too wanted to get married. He wanted to have her waiting. He actually wanted her to follow him to training camp in California. And so for her, war work in Washington was an out from marriage. She liked this guy, but she didn't want to spend the rest of her life with him. She didn't want to get married right away. She didn't want to follow him to training camp in California. So for exactly the opposite reason that the Army thought, she was very interested in taking this work because it gave her a legitimate reason not to have to get married. The other reason that she was very motivated, of course, because her brothers were in the fighting. And like every American family, the Bradens wanted to do everything they could. As you all know, every American family wanted to contribute to winning the war. People were donating pots and pans. They were saving their bacon grease. They were picking up rubber bands off the street. The Braden family had tried to donate their family dog named Poochie to train to become a war dog. And Dot still has the single-spaced letter she got from the Army War Dog Training Center, which was in Manassas, saying, "Thank you very much for trying to volunteer your dog, but we have an age cap on our war dogs, and Poochie is too old." So Poochie had to stay home. But again, that shows you how much people wanted to do anything they could. So Dot was very eager to serve the war effort like her brothers, to try to do what she could to bring her brothers home. She was also making $900 a year teaching school, sending money home to her mom, and working for the War Department, whatever the work was, because they couldn't tell the women because they were recruiting them in public. It was going to be $1,660, so almost twice as much as she would make as a school teacher. And it also offered the opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. And although she grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, 3 hours away from Washington, she had never been to the big city. She had never been farther away than Norton. So it was for all of these women, it was a chance to get out of small towns, to find higher paying work that would be patriotic, fulfilling their patriotic duty, and in her case, to get out of a marriage that she wasn't ready to enter into. And so Dot signed on the dotted line in the fall of 1943, like thousands of other young women. She found herself in Union Station, where she had never been before, and she took a cab to a place called Arlington Hall that you might have heard of. It's still there on Route 50. You can glimpse it through the trees if you're heading from Arlington to Falls Church. The State Department has its Foreign Service Training Center there now, but prior to World War II, it had been a junior college. And you may have heard of junior colleges. They were also a thing back in the day when the idea was to give women some education but not give them too much education. So junior colleges were a kind of a quasi 2 years of high school, a little bit of sort of college classes, maybe English and French, typing, deportment, horseback riding, those sorts of skills. But the Army needed a secure compound for its massive code-breaking operation. We have so many secure compounds now in Northern Virginia, but we didn't have any back then. And it turns out that these girls' schools were ideal because they were large, they had large grounds, they were kind of off the beaten track. You couldn't see them that well from the thoroughfare, I think, to protect the girls, from being in full view of passersby. So it was a perfect location. So the Army kicked those girls out. It took over Arlington Hall. It built these huge temporary buildings where the female codebreakers would be put to work. So that's where Dot found herself in the fall of 1943, still not knowing quite what she had signed up to do. But the very first thing she had to do was sign a loyalty oath to the U.S. government and then sign a secrecy oath in which she agreed that whatever she was doing, she wouldn't talk about it. She agreed that she understood that if she talked about this top secret classified work, the penalty was death, because it was wartime. So that was her welcome to Washington. Basically, whatever you're doing here, you'll be shot if you tell anybody what it is. And by the way, all of these women were given cover stories, essentially. They were told that if anybody asked them what they did at these compounds, they were to say that they were secretaries, that they filled inkwells, they sharpened pencils, they gave people what they needed, the supplies they needed. And because they were women, people readily believed that their work was trivial, that it couldn't be that important. So in that sense, women were the ideal intelligence officers, particularly at that time. This is a shot from inside Arlington Hall. This is the very hasty training that these civilian school teachers are getting. In this case, the classroom, they're learning the geography of Asia. So Dot will find herself working in this massive facility that is full of thousands of women, many of them Southern school teachers who are coming to learn how to be code breakers. This just shows you sort of the order of operations, and I will stop to talk about Vint Hill, because these were women in Arlington Hall who were receiving messages from the teletype, but they probably would have been coming from Vint Hill. So Vint Hill is set up as an intercept station. So it's one of the Army's major intercept stations for intercepting these signals. We got a particularly good signal of the cipher that the Japanese diplomats were using, that they generated with a machine called Purple. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But ultimately, the intercept stations at Vint Hill would be manned by women. The women were WACs, members of the Women Army Corps, and they were initially manned by men. And when I was doing my research, one of the oral histories I found in a women's veterans history collection was of a WAC who came to Vint Hill to work as an intercept operator. And one of the things that she vividly remembered was that the men were all shipped out the day the women came in, and they were all shipped out to the beaches. And she knew that a lot of the men died as a result of the women coming in, and that was knowledge that she carried with her for the rest of her life. And because the work was so secret that the women were doing, she couldn't ever talk about it to anybody. You know, until she gave this oral history toward the end of her life, she had never really talked about that to anybody. So it was it was a lot of the women coming into the code breaking facility. They weren't really replacing men because these were being scaled up. So it wasn't as though they were sending men out to battle, but the intercept operators were, because they were WACs. They were military women, and they were releasing military men for service, and that was very complicated duty. And so the intercepts would then be sent to Arlington Hall. Women would receive them, and then they would be passed to women like Dot, who were learning how to break, in her case, the signals that were used by the Japanese supply ships. So all around the Pacific now, the Japanese army has troops on all these different islands, all these different land masses. Everything that they need has to be brought to them by ship. So the Japanese commandeer supply ships called Marus, and those ships are all day long. They're communicating with where they're coming from, where they're going, what they're carrying, reinforcement troops, medicine, food, fuel, spare airplane parts. Everything has to be brought by ship. And so the school teachers are being taught how to work a complicated code system. It was called a super enciphered code system. So a word like Maru would be rendered as a 4-digit code group, like 6281. And then the Japanese code clerk would add another set of numbers to it as a form of encipherment to change the digits. And that's what would be radioed. And so the school teachers had to learn how to strip out that extraneous encipherment to get down to the code groups. And then they had to figure out what the code groups stood for. So that was the work that they were very quickly trained how to do. And one of the reasons I love this photo, this is the overlappers table. So Dot remembers that she would push the message along as far as she could, and then she would take it to the overlapper. And she remembered that the overlapper was a woman named Miriam. And the thing she remembered about Miriam was that she was from New York City, because not all of the women were from the South. There were women recruited from the North and ultimately the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic seaboard, anywhere the Army could find women. And she described Miriam as the most condescending Northerner she had ever met. And she remembered that in the cafeteria, Miriam would make fun of her Southern accent and say that I've never yet met a Southerner who could speak proper English. And of course, Dot bitterly resented that. And what I sort of like about that anecdote is, for one thing, it shows how for these women from small towns, this was a coming together with women from other parts of the country. So as the men are shipping out, they're seeing the South Pacific, they're seeing Paris, they're seeing Europe for the first time, at great risk to their own lives. The women are living some version of that, in that they're coming to Washington and they're meeting people from all different parts of the country. Many of them will end up marrying men from completely different walks of life than they would have if they had stayed home. But it also shows that this was a government workplace. Although this work was really urgent, it was really important, they knew the stakes, it was like any other government workplace. It was crowded, it was hot, there were stupid bureaucratic directives. At one point, there was a directive that all the Venetian blinds had to be lowered to exactly the same position. People almost resigned after that directive. And there were annoying people that you had to work with. So Dot had to work with Miriam, even though they didn't like each other. And so I think any of us who have worked in any kind of workplace can identify. You know, these women had often been school teachers. That was challenging work, but working in a cooperative workplace in the sort of ultimate, we talk now about open floor plans, you know, those are the thing in offices, but they had the original open floor plans. I like this photo because you see the woman with blonde hair laughing down at her work, sitting beside what looks like a dead plant. What is a dead plant? That's Ann Cara Christie, and she's been recruited out of Russell Sage College in New York. She was an English major, she had no real direction in life, but she was very bright, and she was the daughter of an engineer, an inventor, and she clearly had that kind of mind because she got to work right away, and she and a West Virginia school teacher named Wilma Berryman broke a code system. It was the address that came at the beginning of every Japanese Army message, and it said where the message was coming from, who sent it, the rank of the person, where it was going to, who it was, where they were located, the rank of that person. And that is, it's like the address and return address on an envelope, and that sounds like very boring information. But for our Army, which is trying to figure out who is where and who's on the move and who might be setting up a new unit, who is suddenly communicating with whom, this is incredibly vital intelligence that allowed every day, actually, the code-breaking operation compiled an order of battle. That's called order of battle. And it was an intelligence report that was compiled every day and sent to the Pentagon, which was breathing down these women's neck to get that order of battle report every day. Some of you might have heard of Ann Cara Christie, because speaking of the Cold War, she would rise to become the first female deputy director of the NSA. She would make her career in the business of reading other people's mail, and really devote her life and her career to public service that way. And there were a number of women who came in during the war who would make their careers at NSA after the war. So this, just again to show you how many different code and cipher systems were in use during the war, this was the group that was breaking that diplomatic traffic. So the messages that were being received here at Vent Hill that Japanese diplomats were sending back to Tokyo. So Japan had all these diplomats in Axis countries and occupied countries. They were talking to Hitler, they were talking to Mussolini, they were communicating very long, detailed messages back to Tokyo with all sorts of rich intelligence that we wanted about what was going on in Europe. So to give you, and the reason we were reading that code system was because of a woman named Genevieve Grochin, who was a mathematician, graduated from the University of Buffalo in 1938, couldn't find any college willing to hire her as a math professor, so she came to work for the Army code-breaking operation even before the war, and she had the key insight that enabled us to break that purple cipher. But to give you an example of the kind of intelligence we were getting from that system, the Japanese diplomats were invited to tour the Atlantic Wall, which was Hitler's fortifications on the coast of France. They dutifully reported back in great detail about where the coast was really well fortified and where it wasn't quite so well fortified, so that we were planning the D-Day landings. We knew that Normandy would be a better place to invade than, say, the Calais region. So again, these photos just give you a sense of how many women were doing this work. The Army ultimately had 7,000 women working at Arlington Hall, and the Navy would have 4,000 women working at its facility. So we had at least 11,000 women, and because of wartime coming and going, probably more than that, who were doing this work. There was an African-American unit at Arlington Hall. The U.S. Army was segregated during World War II. The code-breaking operation was also segregated. There were a lot of, the white workers for the most part didn't know that there was an African-American unit. And these were also very well-educated women, probably school teachers who had achieved their education, against great odds in a segregated school system, had been recruited, and they were breaking the codes and ciphers of the private sector. So just as our banks and companies, Amazon, whatever, they encrypt all of our financial transactions, we hope, so too were they doing that during World War II, because all of this stuff was traveling over the airwaves. So banks and companies were looking for ways to encrypt their financial transactions. We wanted to know if anybody was doing business with Hitler, doing business with Japanese companies like Mitsubishi, and that's what the African-American unit was assigned to find out. And so there were also women who were doing cybersecurity. They were encoding and encrypting our military messages to make sure that we weren't being read the way that we were reading the enemy. They were also planning deception programs. So they were creating what was called dummy traffic. And they had to study our military traffic so that they could exactly duplicate it and convince the enemy that we had troops where we didn't have any troops at all. So before the D-Day landings, we wanted the Germans to think that we were going to land, if we did, in Calais. So this fictitious unit was set up called the 1st U.S. Army Group, theoretically commanded by Patton. It did not exist. And these women studied the frequency and patterns of our communications so that we could convince the Germans that we did have troops that were poised to invade Calais. And they not only, and it completely worked, and it had to not only convince the Germans before D-Day, but also after D-Day, so that they would think that the major landing was still to come, so they would keep their troops in Calais and not bring them to Normandy as we were trying to, converge on the beaches and break out into the hedgerows. So meanwhile, so that's the Army operation. The Navy, the women that you saw in frilly dresses at the beginning of the presentation, are now invited to join the U.S. Navy. So World War II was a tipping point for women in the military. It was a hard-fought battle to get women into the military. A lot of the deans and presidents at those women's colleges really beat on the door of the Navy and said it's time to let women into your ranks. They had a lot of battles over things like uniforms, uniform color. At first, the Navy didn't want to let women have navy blue, and that was a lot of meetings to sort of beat that idea down. And the uniforms actually in the end were quite beautiful. And so that shows the women who were in frilly dresses are now sent back to officer training school at Smith College, where they're taught how to command women, how to shoot pistols, and then they're sent to the Navy's code-breaking facility. Is set up also at a girls' school. Mount Vernon Seminary was on Nebraska Avenue, and those girls were kicked out. They had to take classes at Garfinkel's department store while they were looking for a new place to study, and they moved the female codebreakers in. They built barracks on the other side of Nebraska Avenue. So that's where the Department of Homeland Security is now, the facility the women are walking toward, away from their barracks. And because the waves existed now, women could enlist. So you didn't have to have the benefit of a college education to be an ordinary seaman, to be an enlisted woman. But if you tested high for aptitude and intelligence, you would be routed into the code-breaking operation as well. So again, it was an opportunity for women from all over the country, from Oklahoma, from Colorado, from California, to get on troop trains, to train, to go to boot camp, and then to be routed into this code-breaking operation and come to Washington for the first time. And it was a great coming together for these women. One of my favorite anecdotes about what this experience was like for the women, a woman I interviewed for the book, Jane Case, came from a very upper-class family in New York City. She grew up and went to school on the Upper East Side. She went to Miss Chapin's school, which was a very, very prestigious private school. And Jane badly wanted to be in the waves as soon as they were created. She wanted to do her part. Her parents didn't want her to join up. There was a lot of stigma at first associated with women in the military. They were thought to be bad girls. There were actually, slander campaigns, and they were basically prostitutes who were being put in the service to service the men. And so at first there was a lot of resistance, often from families, but Jane really wanted to join up. So she took the subway for the first time in her life to Lower Manhattan, to Wall Street. There was a naval recruiting station, and she expected to go in as an officer, and she knew she'd have to pass an eye exam, and she was very nearsighted, so she had memorized the eye chart. She slipped her spectacles in her pocket, and she passed the eye exam, but she didn't realize there were going to be a lot of other medical stations that she would have to go to in order to be accepted. There was a gynecological station, which was a surprise to the women generally, and then there was a physical. And because the men who joined the Navy were subjected to the humiliation of a naked group physical, so were the women, because the Navy was still figuring out how to treat the opposite sex. And so Jane still remembers being told to take off her clothes, and she had never seen another woman without her clothes on. She said at Miss Chapin's school, we didn't even talk about it. And so all of a sudden there she is, and a petty officer comes up and draws in a red marker the number 9 between her breasts and says, all right, go stand between 8 and 10. And she is so nearsighted that not only does she have to really look at all these other women, but she has to really peer closely at all these other women in order to figure out where she should stand. So that was her welcome to the U.S. Navy. And she had always been told that she wasn't good at math. Her dad was a physicist, and she grew up with kind of a chip on her shoulder thinking that she wasn't good at math, but she scored so high on the aptitude test that she was routed into the code-breaking operation. She wasn't accepted as an officer because she hadn't been to college. She had been to music school after Miss Chapin's school in Boston, and the Navy didn't consider that to be the equivalent of college, so she had to go in as an ordinary seaman. And she loved it. She lived in those barracks. She loved every minute of it. Her first roommate was a woman from the Midwest whose father was an undertaker and gave his daughter a music box in the shape of a casket. And Jane, that was Jane's introduction to decorating schemes that she had not been exposed to on the Upper East Side, and she loved every minute of it. It was such a respite from the sort of boring debutante life that she had been brought up to expect. She was very sorry for the reason that she was there, the fact that we were at war. But again, it gave her a completely different life experience than she would have had otherwise. And so she joined. These are photos that I found that show the inside of the naval code-breaking facility. They were in the National Archives. I had to get them declassified. But they show you the camaraderie. Again, they show you the number of women who were doing this work. Those women, the Naval Fleet Code, they're being passed along by a conveyor belt. I was really happy when I saw this photo because some of the women had remembered the conveyor belt. Jane remembered it, but I had trouble visualizing it. So you can see what that looked like. And this quote from Jane Case, we could tell what was happening in the Pacific because the stack would get larger. Those are all Japanese messages. So those are the stacks and stacks of Japanese messages that the women had to contend with. They had to do math right away to determine which messages were important, which ones weren't. They were looking at certain numerical groups at the very beginning of the messages. They knew that these were life or death decisions that they had to make, even if the work was really repetitive, and it was. They knew that their attention couldn't flag, that they had to continue to pay attention. They knew that we were pushing back across the Pacific Ocean. They knew whenever an amphibious landing was going to happen, whenever we wanted to mount an attack, they would be told that something was about to happen. They would be... Their job, again, was to strip out this encipherment. The Japanese Naval Fleet Code was a 5-digit enciphered code system, and I came upon memos in which they were told, you know, you recovered 2,500 additives. They were called additives. Last week, we need you to beat that number because we have a big action happening in the Pacific. We need to support our men out there, our Marines and our Navy guys. So we need you to work faster and better. And then I would see memos congratulating the women for not only making their quota but exceeding their quota. So that's how hard they were working. It's though they were tethered to the action in the Pacific, and they knew in advance, you know, when actions were going to happen, and of course they couldn't talk about it, but they felt enormous pressure. This is a worksheet. This is a JN25 worksheet, so it just gives you a sense of the hand and brain work that the women were doing as they were stripping out 5-digit numbers and then trying to figure out what the messages likely said. I love this slide. The Japanese Navy set up a number of ad hoc systems as well if they didn't want to communicate in the main fleet code. Maybe they were just communicating between islands or ships. This is called the Inter-Island Cipher. There was a group of women from Wellesley College who were assigned to the Inter-Island Cipher. You can see that it's not a numerical system, it's a table, but it's governed by a key that changes every month. This was a way to scramble letters in Romanized Japanese. And so the Wellesley women had to learn how to break the monthly key that governed how that table worked. But they got so good at it that they could break it in a matter of days. And then once they had ascertained the monthly key, they could kind of go on autopilot to actually break the individual messages. And what I love about this group is that they show how the women's lives were affected by their work. They were living in Washington really unchaperoned for the first time in their lives. If they were officers, they didn't have to live in the barracks. They could live in group houses. And so like everybody else in Washington, the stress and urgency of war, they drank a lot in their off hours. And so, you know, they were letting off steam. They didn't have a lot of off time, but they had some and they took advantage of it. So the women working the Inter-Island Cipher, one woman from Wellesley in particular, who was a great mathematician, and her commanding officer really admired her brains, but he also admired her partying spirit. And she would come to him and she would say, well, when can I have my next big party? And he would look at the wall map showing when the key would change. And he would say, well, you can have it on X day, because that'll give you 2 weeks to recover from your hangovers before you have to break back into the Inter-Island Cipher key. But what I also love about this photo is that it shows how serious the work was, and they knew that. In April of 1943, we got messages in the Pacific saying that Admiral Yamamoto was going to be making an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. Admiral Yamamoto was the commander of the Japanese fleet. He was the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. The women working the Inter-Island Cipher got very busy, working with men out in the Pacific who were also very busy. And together, they put together his itinerary really down to the second of where he was going to be when his plane would be in the air, when it would land, when he was going to be on a minesweeper, and the decision was made to shoot him out of the air. And that was as a result of the precision of the code-breaking operation. And of course, the American public couldn't know that was why we were able to shoot the Admiral's plane out of the air. The Japanese, obviously didn't want them to know, so cover stories were created. But within the code-breaking compound, the women remembered that cheering broke out in the compound when they heard that the Admiral's plane had been shot down, and that shows that for all of these women, there was great satisfaction whenever they knew that their work had led to the killing of the enemy, the sinking of a supply ship, or the downing of an airplane. They knew we were at war. They knew that lives were at stake of the men that they loved. They knew that this was their job. There was no second guessing about the work that they were doing. Later on in their lives, I interviewed some of them. They would come to have obviously more complicated feelings about that work, but they certainly did not second guess themselves in the moment. So again, just quickly, this will show you how vast our operation ultimately became. Our code-breaking operation was bigger than Bletchley Park, and we certainly had more women working here. And so we eventually became the lead partner in the Enigma code-breaking effort in the Atlantic Ocean, the machine being used by the U-boats. Admiral Donitz had become suspicious that the British had broken his cipher system, and they had. And so they changed the design of the naval Enigma that was being used by the U-boats. They added an extra rotor that would scramble the messages even further. So Americans had to get involved to build these big machines that were sort of early computers that could test the key setting for there was the order of the rotors for that day. So as you can see, it was women who were running those machines at the Naval Code-Breaking Headquarters. It was women who were coming up with the computer menus to plug into those machines. It was women who were translating the German messages and then compiling the intelligence. For me, one of the most moving chapters in my book was this group of women, when they were working the midnight watch on June 6th. They knew that D-Day was going to happen. They didn't know when it was going to happen. They thought that it wouldn't happen that night because there was a full moon, and they thought that wouldn't be good for an Allied landing. But they were called that at about 1:30 in the morning our time, they started getting messages. The German messages started coming in, and they were basically saying, oh my God, there are thousands of ships on the English Channel. The Allied landing is happening, and it's happening in Normandy. So this particular group of women got to experience the D-Day landings from the point of view of the Germans, which was who were obviously chattering all night. And the women knew, many of them had fiancés who were glider pilots or who were hitting the beaches. They knew that the landing was taking place. They knew that the Germans were reacting, but they didn't know at the end of their shift how it had gone, who had lived, who had died. So they all took the bus over to National Cathedral, and St. Albans Chapel beside the National Cathedral was open 24/7 during World War II, so they all prayed. And several of them would find that they had in fact lost their husbands in the landings. Again, so it was incredibly serious, important work they were doing. In their infrequent off hours, they tried to have some recreation. My central character, Dot Braden, is behind the pole there. They're at Colonial Beach, I think. You can see that they're writing lots of men. Women were made to feel responsible for the well-being of the men who were fighting. And so again, they were told to keep up morale by writing lots of men. My central character was writing a half dozen men, actually. She had disentangled herself from her fiance, and she was actually almost more reluctant to tell me that than she was to talk about the code breaking. And she would ultimately marry one of the men she was writing. They became engaged purely through correspondence, which was very common at the time. You can see her in the open-toed shoes with her best friend. That's Ruth Weston, who had been a school teacher in Bourbon, Mississippi. She took a 2-day train ride to Washington. She became an incredible mathematician for NSA. She continued working for NSA after the war. So that's Dot and her best friend. That's Dot and her best friend later in life. Dot left the work after the war. Most of the women were told pretty much to leave after the war. Some of them stayed on. So Ruth stayed on as a mathematician with the NSA. But when Ruth got engaged to her husband, Bill Cable, she had Dot and her husband, Jim, come up and vet him before she would agree to marry him. That's how close their friendship was as a result of their experience together. Their children grew up thinking that they were cousins to each other because their mothers were so close to each other. They knew that their mothers had a friendship that had been born during the war. They knew they had done something together, but they never knew what it was. They never knew what the bond was between their mothers. This is a group of naval women who were all enlisted women working in that facility. They too remained such great friends after the war, even as they went their separate ways. they had something that they, a kind of a chain letter that they wrote each other to stay in touch. And that chain letter kept going forever, actually, until only one of them is alive anymore. And that's when the letter stopped, when Ruth Mirsky in the striped shirt at the front didn't have anybody left to write to. But that's how powerful their friendships were. Ruth is 96 now, I think. She's living in Queens. I interviewed her, and her email address is Ruth the Wave. So that shows you how important their identity was to them, how important their military service and this work was, even as they were never able to talk about it. Because after the war, the women were told, the Navy women were told, here's a medal, don't ever show it to anybody. Thank you very much for your service. Go home, get married, have children, and never tell anybody what you did. And that's what they did. The women never told anybody what their work was. In most cases, I interviewed 20 women for my book. Most of them had never talked about it to anybody. And what happened was this work was declassified in the 1980s, but nobody tracked the women down and told them. So they just kept the secret, and most of them took it to their graves. Dot Braden, after the war, both of her brothers survived, and both of them had top secret security clearances after the war in the work that they did. And they would get together and brag about their top secret security clearances. And Dot could never tell her brothers that she had a top secret security clearance also. And so that's what these women had to put up with after the war, really never getting credit for the work that they did. So I just have a couple of quick videos that just allow you to hear their voices of some of the women who I interviewed. So the first one is Dot.
With my 2 suitcases, my umbrella, and my raincoat, I went down to the train. Now my uncle had to take me down there. No car. And my mother and her sister were standing there crying when I got on the train. I was very secure that everything was going to be just that. Washington would receive me with open arms.
And of course, the joke on her was that she was told she would be shot. That was the first thing she was told, if she ever talked about what she did. So the next woman, Anne Seeley, was recruited out of Smith College in 1942, and she would work JN-25, the Japanese Naval Fleet Code.
A narrative is obviously something that you add, but what do you add it to? You add it to a 5-digit code group, and the code group has a meaning, which is either a word, or a phrase, or a sentence, or a Roman letter, because we're dealing in Japanese now, they made much use of the Roman letters, but they often did to spell names of people like Roosevelt.
So Anne had never talked about this work to anybody, and her memory was so good that she would have remembered, for example, that there wouldn't be a Japanese character for a word like Roosevelt. And so there would have to be, each letter would have to be a separate code group in order to spell out the name. That's how precise her memory was of the code. She also remembered the math that she had to do to recover those additives. She tried to show me, and she got a little irritated with me because I was a little slow on the uptake. I was saying, well, okay, they were adding, so were you subtracting or adding? And she said, well, I would zeroize and add. I mean, how hard is that? So again, how incredibly good their memories were of this work. So the next woman, Betty Bemis, was working those big machines that were breaking the German Enigma cipher. And she gives you a sense of the sort of thanks they got for the great work that they did.
We broke the code in August of 1943. And everybody says, what did they tell you? I said, nothing. All that Commander Meter announced at supper one night, good job, girls. You did good. And that's all he said.
And so the last one was Dorothy Romali. You saw her photo. She was recruited out of Indiana State Teachers College. And she gives you, I think, a very good sense of why the women were so powerfully motivated to do this work as soon as they were recruited.
a bus came, and it was at 2 o'clock in the morning that the Army sent a bus to get these, oh, I don't know. It seemed to me it was all the men, you know, that there were no men left there in the college at that time because they all had to go, I think, to Pittsburgh. You see, since I was taking mathematics, a lot of times I was one of maybe 2 girls that were in the classes, you see. So I knew so many of the fellows that were going on that bus. I'll never forget.
So that was her memory. And what I love also about Dorothy O'Malley is that she did become a math teacher after the war. She taught middle school, public middle school math in Arlington, Virginia at Swanson Middle School, which is the same middle school that my children would ultimately attend. And I just love the image of all of these middle schoolers taking Miss O'Malley's Algebra 1 class or whatever, having no inkling that this sweet, kind woman, who people remember as the best math teacher they'd ever had been a remarkable code breaker, a truly badass code breaker during World War II. She was so good at what she did that she started out working for the Army's operation, and the US Navy managed to steal her from the Army by offering an officer's housing allowance, and that little bit of extra money made a difference to her. So she moved from the Army effort to the Japanese Naval Fleet Code. And so I just love the example of how these women continued, and in some cases continue, to walk among us without ever getting credit for their contributions and without ever expecting credit for their contributions. And so it was an incredible experience for me to get to have these conversations with them, and a real honor to be trusted with their stories and try to illuminate the contributions that they made. And I had the good fortune of being on a panel with Margaret Shetterly, who wrote Hidden Figures, about the women mathematicians of NASA, African-American women mathematicians. And she made this great metaphor that it's as though there have been these women laboring in rooms for all of American history, and nobody knew that they were there. And it's as though gradually people are coming on and just turning on the light switch, and we can see that there are these rooms full of women who've been here all along. And so thank you for coming out and showing interest in their story, and it was a great pleasure to try to tell it. I'd be happy to take questions.
Folks, if you have questions, please use the microphone because we are recording this, and otherwise they won't hear your question. So let me come out around front here, and if you want to raise your hand.
Hi, thank you. That was really great.
Thank you.
And my husband and I are going to be over in England in June and July, and we're going to go. Bletchley is now a national site over
I
there.
know,
So
yes.
we're going to Bletchley.
Yeah.
I can't wait. But we have Arlington Hall still. We have other places. Do you know if there's been any efforts to do anything to make any of them open to visitors, or memorial, or a park, or anything?
No, and feel free to write your member of Congress.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, we do have the Cryptologic Museum that's attached to Fort Meade.
Right, right.
And that's our little version of Bletchley Park. But I think because we had these competing operations, because the Army and the Navy were physically separate, we didn't have a single manor house like Bletchley Park. It just didn't happen in the same way. It didn't get memorialized, and people don't know about it. Again, our code-breaking operation was larger than Bletchley Park. We had more people doing it, but we just don't have this kind of glamorous manor house, and it's too bad. And I think there is an effort being made to expand the Cryptologic Museum, but as always, you know, they need funding. And I would love to see a statue or a plaque or something outside of Arlington Hall and or Nebraska Avenue, which is right, you know, the Naval Annex, as it was called, is right there on Nebraska Avenue. It would be nice to see some tribute. I would point out that there is a monument, as there should be, to the Navajo Code Talkers, who were also part of our cybersecurity effort. And it just would be nice to see the women get recognized.
So who do you lobby for that? Okay. All right. Thank you.
A wonderful talk, thank
Thank
you. But I'm just curious, were you able to connect any of these women together now who did not know each other before?
Yeah, that would take, we tried, I did a talk at the Library of Congress. They have a Veterans History collection, and we tried to see if we could get some of the women to come. It was a little bit too spur of the moment because transportation for most of them is challenging. They're mostly in wheelchairs, not all, but most of them. But I would love to find some way to get the women together. It would take a significant effort on the part of them and their families. But I'd love to see it happen. I personally haven't been able to organize it myself, but I wish that the Women's Veterans Society or somebody would. There's no reason that it couldn't happen.
Has there been an effort to find out more about the African American women?
Yeah, and that was hard for me because their records were not extensive at all. And what records exist are mostly of the post-war period of African American employment there. So there's one brochure that the NSA has produced on the African American codebreakers, and it's mostly about post-war. Again, I keep hoping that maybe there's a family out there whose mother said she was a secretary, and who might come forward and have some more information on that, because that was one area that I would have loved to have written more about.
You mentioned that they were doing the Pacific piece a lot. Were they utilizing Japanese women that might have been in the internment camps to help?
Not that I can tell. I haven't. There was one woman in her oral history remembered a Japanese man at the Naval Annex who was working as an interpreter because the first time she saw him, she was bringing a code book into a secure room, and he opened the door, and she thought that the Naval Annex had been taken over because they were so told that that could happen and you can't trust anybody, and she felt awful about that afterwards. But I haven't heard of any Japanese women being used as translators.
Let me make a comment on that. If you go to the museum, you will see a photograph of Japanese American soldiers who were stationed at Vint Hill to translate the Japanese into English. So on the male side, it looks like, because of course we had some troops and they were mostly used in Europe and became famous for their bravery, blah, blah, blah. So there was some use of them, but I guess not for the women.
Yeah. Not that I know of.
Hi, thank you for bringing to light, shedding light on these women. I had a question. Will you be bringing this talk to middle schools and high schools, perhaps?
I would be happy to do that. There is going to be a young readers edition of the book that come out in the fall, and that'll be targeted actually mostly at older elementary schools. But I've done some speaking in high schools. Just the other day actually.
I found your speech very interesting. One question, were there any lady Marines involved?
There would not, I don't know about involving the code breaking. There were women Marines, and what I love, one of the women I interviewed who came in as a code breaker, her sister became a Marine. Now, the women Marines very well might have done communications, because a lot of women for the Navy and the Army, all the services, did communications, and they were encoding our messages. I interviewed women for the Coast Guard who were encoding and receiving our messages. But what I love about the Marines, and this is a digression, when I was talking to this family, I was talking to this man about his mother who was a Marine, and I said, so what were the Marines called? I mean, we had spars, and we had waves, and we had wax, and we had wasp. He said, somebody asked the commander of the Marines what the women were called, and he said, Marines. Which I thought was so great.
I was just curious. Oh, great book, by the way. Our
Thank
book
you.
club loved it.
Thank you.
Fantastic book. How much cooperation did you get from like the Army, the Navy, the intelligence agencies when you were researching? Because I'm sure you kind of maybe came close to a line now and then.
Yeah, no, I don't think I think, I was always in communication, particularly with the NSA historian's office. All of our intelligence agencies and so many of our federal agencies have great historians' offices, and the historians there are wonderful public servants, and certainly wanted to facilitate this book. there were other books being written, they facilitate those as well, they do as much as they can. It still was an effort to get a lot of material declassified. It's World War II, you'd think it would all be declassified, but I had to file a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests. I had to, wait in some cases a year. They had 20 oral histories that had been done with people like Anne Cara Christie and some of the NSA women. I had to get all those declassified. There's a multi-volume history that was written of Arlington Hall, and I was able to get 3 volumes declassified, but still there are other, and I don't even, they can't even tell me how many there are. So I just kept banging on the door. I had to upgrade my FOIA request to mandatory declassification review, which is sort of the nuclear option. But I will say, I felt like I can't speak for the NSA, I only worked with 2 people. I worked with an historian and then a director of policy planning, but I think that it was understood that this is a good story for the NSA, right? It's better than one more story about Edward Snowden. So I didn't feel as though there was any kind of conspiracy. I didn't feel as though there was any resistance, really, to getting it out. It's more that the FOIA process is so time-consuming because all the FOIA offices are deluged by requests. So, I don't think I came close to any lines, but I did. I was very persistent. If I was at the National Archives and I was looking at one of the, they had some redacted versions of the histories, and I would see a page, and the footnotes would have all these women's names, and then all the stuff that they did would be redacted. And so I would take a photo of that page and I would send it to the director of policy planning who was in charge of the FOIA, and I would say, look, here are all these women and I want to show what they did. It's not like there's going to be a lot more, but maybe, but this is your shot to get it out there. So I just put pressure on them in any way that I could to
Let me do a quick footnote on that one too. As you probably know, the members of the intelligence community have different formal and informal policies about what they're going to release, and NSA is famously among the most conservative in terms of what they're willing to release.
Yeah.
In 2005, I was at Bletchley, and I was with English friends who had told me that it had just been in recent years that Bletchley had become part of the national park system over there. Apparently, the people who were interested in trees were petitioning because there was disclosure about Bletchley being closed down. And it was the trees that allowed people to say, you can't close Bletchley, it has all these wonderful trees. So they kept Bletchley open. And when I was there, I was the only American, I was with some English friends, and we had a wren who had worked at Bletchley. At that time, she was 83 years of age, and she was our tour guide or our docent for the day. It was an experience like I've never had before in my life. But if you are going to Bletchley, it's really worth spending almost the whole day there because the property is just fantastic.
And I've heard that the Imitation Game is good. It had been a good advertisement for Bletchley Park also, and they've done renovations and really upgraded the facility.
Hi, I volunteer at the Women's Memorial Foundation, and I'm curious if there's been any discussion with them about having an exhibit about these women.
I haven't had a discussion with them, but I'd love to hear from them.
Yeah, okay, well maybe
I'm easy to reach,
I'll put a word in.
Okay, great.
Because, it'd be a good way to publicize this information.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's
Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I have a question for you about the fact that even though the information was declassified, were some of the women still hesitant after all of these years?
Yeah.
Just
very
not from
hesitant.
a personal and emotional level, but
Right.
just from a
Yeah, it took me half an hour to get Dot to talk about what she did, and we even had, basically the NSA saying, please talk about what she did. And her son was there with me because he had all of his life wanted to know what his mother did. And so the two of us were egging her on, and she wanted to talk, but she was very reluctant. She was at war with herself. And at one point she said, well, what will they do? They'll put me in prison? And I said, well, at your age, it will probably be a nice prison. And so she thought that was funny. And and Jane Case also, who had those great anecdotes about becoming an enlisted woman, I had to spend a couple hours with her before she would start to talk about it. I'll tell them that you have, there's a question down here afterwards.
Are they going to make a movie about this?
So it has been optioned, and that's the first step of the process. And I'm sort of watching the rest of the process unfold. It's still kind of in the beginning stages, but the screenwriter has done a lot of screenplays about men at war, like Band of Brothers, and he's very, very interested in the women's story and how war changes women, in addition, to changing men. So I'm optimistic. But this is the first time I've ever been through this process.
It needs to be a mini-series.
Yeah.
There you go.
How long did it take you to write this book?
So it took me about 3 years start to finish, from my first interview with Dot to, my last chance to mark up pages. So I could have researched it for another year, but that's how long I had. Yeah.
How could this work have been done without a knowledge on the part of the code breakers of the Japanese language?
I get asked that a lot. So the numerical codes, like the Japanese Army and Navy were using, so there's a 5-digit or 4-digit code group. You don't really have to think in your head Maru. You can think supply ship. You can really sort of think whatever the concept is. Without knowing the underlying language. Although most of them did get some training, those military messages were so stereotyped that they knew that they would look for the code group. It was coming from a certain station, going to another station. They knew that maybe they should be looking for aviation gasoline, that's what that ship carried a lot. So they learned stereotyped Japanese words that they might be looking for, but they didn't need a lot of Japanese for those numerical ones. If it was this might be more than you want to know, but the Enigma cipher and the Japanese purple machine, which transformed letters. The Enigma was transforming a German message and scrambling it, and once we got it unscrambled, we did need people who understood German to translate those. So if the women had been studying German, that was what they'd be used for. And similarly, if it was that Japanese machine, they would be scrambling Romanized Japanese, spelled phonetically. And we did need people who spoke Japanese who could translate those messages. A lot of it could be done once you knew the key without understanding the language, but then somebody had to get involved toward the end and actually translate them. It is amazing that it worked. It's just amazing to me that it all worked.
Could you elaborate on their change of heart? You mentioned the change of heart about their work. They were excited initially, then.
Yeah. Well, so one of the women I interviewed, Jewel Bannis-Esmacher, she was recruited from Winthrop College in South Carolina. She was a high school band director. And musical ability is a good marker for code-breaking talent. She sank a convoy. And she broke a message and she took it up to the big boys as she remembered. And then she heard over the radio that a convoy had been sunk and she knew that that was her work. And of course, she was very satisfied in the moment. And it was later on in life that she had her own children and her own family. And then she came to think, well, those were Japanese families and they lost their sons, their young sons. And it wasn't that she regretted doing the work, but she, more fully understood what the costs were and had more complicated feelings. Now, some of the women, the next generation was the generation that fought in Vietnam or maybe protested the war. And so, our collective feelings about war became much more complicated. So one of the women remembered proudly telling her daughter that she sank a convoy, and her daughter saying, "Oh my God, Mom, that led to deaths." And so, she was like, "You have no idea what it was like, freedom and liberty were at stake." And so just even in a generation, sort of, we all came to have more complicated feelings about war.
What triggered you to, on this journey, to write this book?
I came upon a declassified history of actually the women who were breaking Russian messages during the war. They would become the core of the people on the Venona project during the Cold War. But they were also school teachers recruited during the war, because that's when we started our Russian code breaking. We weren't supposed to be breaking the Russian code systems because they were our ally, but we didn't trust them, and so we were. So an NSA historian wrote a very good history of that, and he interviewed a number of those women. and noted that they were school teachers, often from southwestern Virginia, where I'm from. And I was so intrigued by that I went and interviewed the NSA historians to find out more about that. I just thought that it was just that little project. And then they told me about the much larger recruitment of women to break German and Japanese code systems. So then I just had to figure out if I could find the women, and then I had to figure out if I could get paper documentation, if I could find archival records to support what they remembered.
In relation to the competition between the services, to what extent was there also cooperation, cross-pollination, perhaps technical assistance, not only between the services, but also, say, with other allied code-breaking operations such as Richie?
Absolutely. We became very cooperative. I mean, at the beginning of our entry into the war, Bletchley Park didn't tell us that they had broken the Enigma cipher because they were understandably skeptical about our ability to keep that secret. And of course it had to be kept secret. I mean, if you can't have the enemy knowing that you've broken their code system, because they'll change their code system, as the Germans did, ultimately. So the British were very protective of that breakthrough with the Enigma until they came to trust us. And then we came to work very closely. So our code-breaking unit, that woman at the big machine, they were communicating every day with England. The breaking of that sort of password every day, the key that controlled the order setting, the rotor setting, England would do. They would work on part of it. They would send those findings over to us. We would work on part of it. So we were totally cooperative. We sent people to Bletchley Park. They sent people here. We also had code-breaking units out in the Pacific. We were working with people from Australia and New Zealand, the Canadians. So it was very cooperative and a very collaborative effort. And even our competition between our U.S. Army and our U.S. Navy, they were definitely talking all the time. They were meeting every week, at least. And probably communicating by secure line every day. And I don't think the competition was always a bad thing. When we broke the Japanese Naval Fleet Code and we knew how to read the Japanese naval signals, the Army hadn't yet broken the major code system that was controlling those supply ships that DOT would work on. And they were very aware that the Navy had broken the Naval Fleet Code. And so they were they would have been motivated anyway. But I think sometimes that inter-service competition was actually even more of an incentive.
So these women were enlisted as military members, so wax and waves, and then similar to our system today, were they enlisted if they hadn't completed their college degree, and officers if they had completed their college degree?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the Navy wanted its female codebreakers to be subject to the military hierarchy and military discipline. So they really had to join the waves. And the good thing about that is they qualify for GI benefits after the war. So that's how the naval code-breaking system worked. They had officers and they had enlisted women. You could be an officer if you had if you had a college degree, or I think it was 2 years of college and maybe 2 years of work. And then enlisted women, you didn't have to have a college degree. And there was such a rush to join up that the women tended to be overqualified, even if they had a college degree. There was a cap on the number of officers at first. So a lot of the enlisted women had college degrees also. You know, it was a very, but the Army codebreakers, for the most part, stayed civilians. The Army wanted its codebreaking force to be civilian for whatever reason. It led to situations where 22-year-olds like Ann Carroll Christie, if they were really talented, those women would be put in charge of a whole major unit. So it allowed for more flexibility, but it meant that the women didn't qualify for the same benefits. And there were some WACs also who came in, but not as many as the Navy had waves.
Other questions?
Maybe like one question after this. Yeah.
Really enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
Did you run into any reporting on women's involvement in other classified activities such as Manhattan and Radiation Lab?
Well, that's interesting. When you were saying that, I was thinking OSS, because certainly there were women recruited as spies. But there were so many women doing brain work and doing, early, all of the STEM, running computers. I mean, the Army's ENIAC computer was programmed by women. The Navy's MARC computer was programmed by Grace Hopper. And I just got an email from a woman whose mother was doing early sort of GPS out in the Pacific. So she was designing early navigation systems. So again, because the men were fighting and because there was so much brain work that had to be done with all of these systems that were being developed, I don't know so much about the systems that you talked about. Well, there were definitely women scientists at the Manhattan Project. So I do feel like there are more stories like this to be told.
Yeah, it's a very interesting talk. Do you have any idea how many of the women after the war continued in the intelligence business?
You know, I don't know. I don't think I ever got numbers on how many ended up working for the NSA. Ann Kiera Christie did. Her West Virginia school teacher, Wilma Berryman, did. Juanita Moody became head of Cuban code breaking. She was head of it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were women working the East German, Communist China systems. And most of the early super grades at NSA were women. So there was a significant generation of women who stayed with the work. It's just that if they had children, they were expected to stop working. So Ruth Weston, the mathematician, who was Dot's great friend, I found in her personnel file her handwritten resignation letter when she became pregnant, because she said, I'm resigning my position as an NSA mathematician because I'm expected to stay home with my baby. So that was the trade-off that the women had to make if they stayed with the work after the war. For the most part, they didn't get married, and for the most part, they didn't have children.
Let's give Liza a huge
Thank you.
round of applause.